This is the HP Pavilion Slimline s7410n, a consumer-grade desktop computer from 2006. Where do I even begin with this thing? Well, let's start off with the fact I actually made a video on this computer back when I got it about a year and a half ago. This was an eBay find, and I pretty much bought it for one reason and one reason alone. We might as well just rip this band-aid off right now. This is a desktop computer with a laptop processor in it, but not just any laptop processor, an Intel Celeron M. Do you remember that Toshiba laptop I covered a while ago, the one with a Celeron D? This is like the exact opposite of that. So, the most obvious question is, why? Well, I think it's relatively simple. This thing is just too small to fit anything better. Seriously, this computer is tiny. It's hard to describe just how small this thing is without seeing it in person. But HP's main marketing point for this machine, it's a full desktop PC that's just a third of the size of a mid-tower. As you'll see later on when I take it apart, there really is not a lot of room in this computer. And assuming we stick with Intel here, there really were no good options back in 2005 whenever this would have been designed. Back in those days, Intel's offerings were the Pentium 4 and later the Pentium D, which were largely inferior to AMD's offerings at the time. Those processor families had two very important traits. They ran extremely hot and drew a lot of power. Heck, even Intel's Celeron D back in this time was also drawing a lot of power. I think if any of these processors ended up in this computer, it would have been an absolute nightmare. It just had to be a mobile processor. That was just what could work. But did it have to be a Celeron? Couldn't it have at least been a Pentium M or like a Turion or something? I mean, Turion, I don't know, but Pentium M feels like that probably could have been okay here. For better or for worse though, that's just not what they went with. But there's another thing about this computer that's odd. This thing, a Celeron M desktop computer, apparently shipped with Windows XP Media Center Edition. I've even seen some sites label this thing as a Pavilion Media Center PC, though I think that's something to be taken with quite a bit of salt. It's just that Windows XP Media Center Edition apparently was a thing you could have bought with it. And for some reason, I find this option to be really strange. I just can't pinpoint exactly why. The thing is though, a small, compact machine like this, I think, could have had some utility as a media center machine. Something small like this could have fit much better in an entertainment center or something. And I mean, in general, having a full desktop machine that's that much smaller than a traditional mid-tower is pretty cool, at least to somebody like me who's trying to save space. For both of those things, it can't have any compromises. And there's already a major compromise before we've even powered it on. And the small form factor tax is insane here. The S7400 series is listed on HP's website from April 2006 at $530 after rebate. From this same website, you could buy an equivalent level A1200 series mid-tower PC for like half the cost. Or for roughly the same price as this computer, you could get a mid-tower machine with way better hardware in it. And what else exactly do you get for that money? I mean, first of all, we've got that Intel Celeron M processor, specifically the Celeron M390 clocked at a whole 1.7 gigahertz on an Intel 915 motherboard. So you know what that means, Intel 915 integrated graphics. This also would have had 1 gigabyte of DDR2 RAM, a 250 gigabyte hard drive, an IDE DVD-RW drive, and Windows XP Media Center Edition apparently. Also, a bit of a side note, while browsing the Internet Archive, I couldn't help but notice that the successor to this machine, the s7510 series, specifically mentions Intel Pentium or AMD Turion processors, but this one was stuck with a Celeron M. Too bad. I will say I do like how this thing looks. It's basically entirely silver. The curved front panel is maybe a little bit dated, but otherwise I think it's fairly nice. It looks and feels pretty good quality. I mean, for any HP product, I think that's pretty high praise. They have crammed quite a bit into this small chassis. They've got a pretty decently capable card reader on the front, as well as a single USB port and a single headphone jack. There's a full-size DVD drive hiding under this flap, and somewhere in here there's supposed to be a hard drive LED. There's this clear plastic strip that also has the optical drive status LED, and of course the obvious stickers and the power button. And fun fact, this machine has a multicolor power LED, as when the system goes into standby, instead of pulsing the LED, it becomes amber. I love it whenever I get a computer that does this. On the back of the machine, we have the unsurprisingly small power supply. We have PS2 keyboard and mouse ports, a digital audio out port, VGA port without the screws this time, 4 USB ports, a FireWire port, and 10100 Ethernet, and even surround sound audio, because why the hell not? And there's also a modem on this machine, which is an expansion card. And of course there's also a hole, or specifically lots of holes for ventilation, but we'll come back to this in a little while. The sides also have some holes on them, particularly nearby the hard drive area, as on both sides and the bottom of the case there's some ventilation holes. There's also a HP Pavilion information sticker and that Windows XP product key. Now HP does also have rubber feet on the case for either orientation you want, vertical or horizontal. For whatever reason, there's a pretty big color difference between the two here, so maybe this thing was laying on its side for most of its life. Otherwise, I already covered the internals in the original acquisition video, specifically because I ended up having to take this all apart to redo some of the cable management in this machine to try and improve it. But let's go through it again anyway. The first thing of note is that this is just one single cover, as the bottom is integrated into this side panel. I think this makes sense. It's a lot easier to work on it this way, though it can mean the computer is a little bit unstable if it's standing vertically without its side panel. The first most obvious thing is this fan shroud. This fan is set up to exhaust air out the back of the case, so it's got this shroud to try and guide the air that way. And it's entirely toolless, as it basically clips into the optical drive bay, and it basically has to be removed in order to do anything on this machine. For the most part, it's a standard fan, though it is quite thin, so keep that in mind, I suppose. Next, we have the optical drive. Though you might be wondering, with such a compact machine, how the hell are they going to fit an IDE cable in here? Well, say hello to this monstrosity. This is the IDE cable for this machine. If we remove a couple things, we can get a better look at this cable, particularly the optical drive and the PCI modem, which, by the way, has the world's smallest retention bracket I think I've ever seen. We can get a look at this IDE cable, which is essentially a laptop-style ribbon cable that's just got an IDE bit attached to it. I guess I'll give them points for creativity, but I'd say that makes it proprietary to this computer. Fortunately, the hard drive uses SATA, and there is a spare SATA port on the board, so you could replace the IDE drive with a SATA one. So at the very least, if the cable breaks or it's been removed from this machine, it is still possible to hook up an optical drive to it. The hard drive is located directly below the optical drive in this big ol' metal bracket. And with the hard drive removed, we can take out the entire drive cage. It's just screwed in to the chassis. I definitely appreciate it. They could have just riveted it in, but to be fair, I think this had to be removable because otherwise this would have been impossible to work on. The screw locations are also kind of strange, but whatever, I'm still glad you can do it at all. One legitimate positive about this entire thing is that cable management is pretty good. There's just not many cables to begin with. There's a single Molex connector and a single SATA connector, but otherwise there are no other cables on this power supply, which appears to be a pretty good quality unit manufactured by Akbel, and it seems to be overall a pretty standard form factor. However, unsurprisingly for such a strange board, this has a proprietary power supply connector, as while it is technically a 24-pin connector, it's much smaller than a traditional one you'd see on a regular board. This power supply also only makes 108 watts, so what you see is what you get. We've finally gotten to that motherboard, which is the PTGV-DM from Asus. With the exception of that power supply connector, this is otherwise pretty much an entirely standard mini ITX board as far as I'm aware. It does take full-size DDR2 RAM, albeit some pretty slow stuff. This was upgraded to its max of 2 GB of RAM, which is basically the only hardware change that was made to it. There is the CPU heatsink, which is pretty much just a slightly larger chipset heatsink. Under this, of course, is going to be that socket 479 CPU. Unfortunately, the CPU heatsink uses these retention clips that are just kind of soldered right into the board. It's hard to describe, but it's just not a system I like engaging with personally, so I've just kind of left it alone. I get why it's done this way, because, you know, trying to find spot for screws here is tough, but still. Otherwise, there is no expansion possibility with this board other than that spare SATA port, and I guess there would have been a spare RAM slot, but otherwise, every connector or slot on this board is being used, which that really doesn't happen very often. Everything is pretty much contained in that chipset on the board. There is also this Realtek audio chip, the very tiny ALC880, which as far as I'm aware was also found in the Pavilion A1206N. There's also some unused spots on this I/O shield for a parallel port and another audio port, but there's just no physical room on this board to make those work. This I/O shield probably was just used from a different computer or something. So I will say, genuinely, this is a pretty good piece of engineering, I think. It's honestly a lot easier than it looks to work on. And with the exception of one single connector on this entire system, it is all standard, which that's pretty cool. Unfortunately, this is where things start going downhill. Before we get into the operating system though, we should probably take a quick look at the BIOS. It's not very interesting after all. HP probably forgot about it too, because the BIOS revision that was on this computer when I got it was already the latest version, not something that happens very often. And based on the BIOS date, it probably was the version that shipped with this computer. Despite that, this chip on the board here, which I believe is the BIOS chip, is marked 3.04. About the most interesting things would be all the various I/O options, including a ton of different VRAM configurations for some reason. There's also a built-in hardware monitor, which is cool, I guess. Some power settings I don't care about, and that is basically it. As for the operating system, I already kind of went over this in the acquisition video. Essentially, since I didn't have the exact media for this computer, I used the restore media that I did on the HP Pavilion A1206N that I covered a while ago. That media was not for that machine at all, but I made it work anyway. And in fact, it turned out that media was better suited for this machine rather than that A1206N. It's funny how that works. But we're not using that at all, because after I filmed that video, I got an actual HP Media Center PC, and I later set this computer up with that machine's original media, which is basically identical but has a couple more updates on it and a couple more pieces of software. And spoiler alert, we're going to primarily take a deeper dive into that media when I cover that machine eventually, so let's say this is pretty much got an identical software setup to what I covered on the A1206N. But wait a minute, how am I going to make this interesting then? Well, by upgrading it to Windows Vista, of course. Yeah, I don't really know why I did this, but I mean, it is a supported configuration, technically. It has drivers. Barely, but it does. Of course, we might as well take a quick look at Media Center on this machine. which has a couple HP specific things added onto it, specifically HP PhotoSmart and HP Games. PhotoSmart still works despite being upgraded to Windows Vista. HP Games, on the other hand, does not. And of course, there's some other things in the program library section. As for preloaded software, there is a lot going on here. And again, we'll take a good look at this in a different video, but this specific copy of Windows is maybe one of the most bloated system restore images I think I've ever seen. There is so much stuff on here that's primarily third-party software, but of course there is a lot of HP things as well. A lot of the usual suspects like Adobe Reader, it's got Microsoft Works, you have a ton of dial-up services on here, and of course I installed all of them, because who wouldn't? It has HP's own DVD player software. It has this movie software on it. It's even got fucking WeatherBug. I mean, there's so much stuff here. I could probably go on and on. Of course, like 98% of the software is completely pointless and is just third-party stuff anyway. Probably the most useful thing this install has would be the LightScribe software, and that can be found online anyway. Pretty much all the stuff works anyway, despite being upgraded to Windows Vista. A couple things throw compatibility errors, but for the most part everything seems to work fine. The only thing that didn't survive the upgrade was Norton 2006, and honestly that's probably a good thing.
Welcome to Real Player, the media player that lets you play anything. Use your Real Player to play online audio and video with the best image and sound quality available.
So how's the performance on this thing? This may be a total surprise to you. It's not good. I mean, first of all, let's just be completely honest. The absolutely bloated, messy Windows install is not helping anything. In fact, no, I'm gonna go even further than that. I don't think Windows, period, is helping anything. Outside of the preloaded stuff on this computer, I have a bit of a problem. I don't actually know what to install on it. One of the things I did install was a web browser because I needed to download a couple files. A task that most computers from this time period should be able to do, even if it's working extremely hard. But not this one. Attempting to load Google here was nearly a 3-minute task, and that can basically be said about any web page I've loaded on this thing. Basically, if you want to actually get anything done on this computer, you need to type in a web address, walk away for about 5 minutes, and come back. And maybe it'll be fully loaded by then. I'm being serious. I like to think I'm a very patient person because of garbage like this, but this thing really was testing my patience. This, I am almost certain, would have been far more usable back when it was new. But it is just not anymore. And the bottleneck here is obvious. It unfortunately does not take very much at all to max out that poor Celeron. Even tasks that seem relatively simple, like playing an audio CD or playing a DVD, let's stick to the Media Center theme here, or if you're like me and don't have any DVDs, the Halo 2 bonus disc. These kinds of things are workable, but it's working hard enough that if you try and multitask by just having a couple more programs open, these things are going to start stuttering. On a very basic level, it does work, but it just doesn't work very well. Pretty much anything else you could have bought in 2006 probably would have been noticeably better than this setup. I have to imagine a Pentium M definitely would be an improvement, and I'm like almost certain this board should be able to take it. So it may be something I'm going to try in the future. I mean, it's basically only up from here. Unfortunately, this platform just does not have a very high ceiling. Assuming this was purchased in April or May of 2006, it wouldn't be very long before Intel's new Core processors would be released. And not only were those processors much better for the most part, but they had flexibility going for them. If you had a CPU that sucks, you could probably do something about it and get to a better one. You just can't really do that here. Whenever I do these videos, one of the things I like to do is run old games on the system, just to see how it would do, but I might as well just substitute footage from that compact laptop here, because it's almost certainly going to be very similar, if not worse. Considering this chipset barely even has functioning drivers for Windows Vista, it doesn't even support Windows Aero, I think we can already assume how it probably would go. That's not to say it can't be used for basic or super old stuff, but anything beyond that, yeah, it's not built for that. And unfortunately for me, I also ran Cinebench R10 on this machine. And there's no other way of putting it. This computer has officially produced some of the worst scores on this entire list of things I've tested, thanks to it only being a single core CPU. You know what? We've been talking about negatives for a while, so let's try and find any positives. What better way to do that than to talk about thermals? That's probably the only other thing of interest on this entire thing. The best thing I can say is that the thermals are fine. They're not overly bad. One of the legitimate advantages about this machine is that it does run incredibly quietly, and it's not like the actual box itself gets hot or anything, so you probably wouldn't notice anything. But I have to be honest, monitoring the temperatures, I wasn't really that impressed. This thing easily can idle at 50 degrees Celsius, and under certain circumstances, like for example playing a disc where a significant chunk of the CPU is being used, the temperatures can be like 55 degrees. And when fully utilizing it, it can be over 60 degrees. Now again, that's fine. It's not overheating or throttling or anything. I wouldn't say there's any reason to be concerned. But remember earlier how I said it didn't take very much at all to max out this processor? Well, that basically means it's going to be running around this level, 55 to 60 degrees, all the time. The other thing is that because there can be rapid fluctuations in CPU usage, there can also be rapid fluctuations in the temperature. This thing's temperature can spike up several degrees and then immediately drop back down. I honestly hope the thermal paste on this machine sucks, because otherwise I just don't think this is really that good for this level of hardware. The other thing is that this is not just about the processor in this machine. The power supply also runs quite warm in my experience. This is kind of to be expected, after all, it's, pretty tightly packed together. This power supply's fan setup is also the complete polar opposite of the CPU fan, as it's an intake fan, so it pulls air in from the case and pushes it throughout the power supply and eventually out the back. And this next part is where things really get interesting. Removing the side panel top cover thing saw temperatures drop by about 5 to 10 degrees. Not only was the CPU running cooler, but that power supply was as well. To me, this setup could have benefited at least a little bit by having ventilation on this cover. There's basically no intake on this machine at all. So how are you going to expect to draw in cooler air if it's a completely closed off panel? They were clearly willing to put holes in it because they did it around the hard drive area, and the end result is that hard drive thermals are pretty good on this machine. The best thing I can close this segment out with is by reiterating a point I brought up earlier, which is that at the very least, it is pretty quiet. This fan can get pretty loud. Occasionally it will happen when the system's first plugged in, but otherwise it pretty much maintains a consistent 1400-ish RPM speed. Only when this thing is being super taxed will the fan get a little bit faster. And outside of a maybe slight grumbliness to it, you probably wouldn't even notice it at all. The only noise you probably would be hearing from this machine would be the hard drive. And speaking of which, to end this all off, we might as well touch over the drives real quickly. I did not get the original hard drive with this machine, so I opted for an equivalent spec drive, as far as I'm aware, which turned out to be a WD Caviar drive that's a little bit newer than the computer, but is passable in my opinion. It's a 250GB, 7200 RPM SATA drive. It's a little bit loud, but it's fine. As for the DVD drive, that would be a unit manufactured by Toshiba Samsung, the TSH552L. It's just your average DVD-RW drive. Probably the most interesting thing about it is it has light scribe capability. Unfortunately, the belt's going bad on this drive, so it has a hard time opening and closing, and usually needs some assistance. And unfortunately it vibrates like crazy and just makes all kinds of weird noises. Now it does unsurprisingly work a lot better when the computer is in a horizontal position, but that doesn't solve everything. So where do I even end this video? I mean, to reiterate, on a very basic level, it does work. I just don't think it works very well. You might be wondering about hardware upgrades. That isn't really something I've talked about up until now. Aside from the obvious, and we already talked about that, I do have a couple more ideas of how to improve this thing. It's already been upgraded to 2 GB of RAM, and while it absolutely would be bottlenecked to hell thanks to this old chipset, an SSD would help, and it would be way easier here because this has already got a SATA hard drive. And maybe, just maybe, a PCI graphics card that could fit in this computer might help a little bit. At the very least, it'd make it more interesting, but I'm not sure about that one. This might be a future video, but just thinking about it, I'm not convinced that really any of these things are going to improve it that much. Like I said, this computer just has a very low ceiling, unfortunately. We're not far from that ceiling, and it's already not desirable as is. While it may have been okay at the time, it wouldn't take very long for this computer to basically be obsolete. And nowadays, there's basically no real reason to have this. If you want a Windows XP computer or something like that, basically anything would do better. Even small form factor stuff, you could do a lot better. Much newer, much more efficient, just better hardware for not much money. Usually even the bad stuff I can usually find some kind of use for, but this one, perhaps unbelievably, pretty much is positioned in my collection just as a novelty. This computer otherwise maybe gets pulled out a few times a year at most, just to see if it still works. Nothing makes that more apparent than comparing the amount of hours on this hard drive compared to when I started, and most of them were just because I was filming this video. So yeah, unfortunately, I've said that word a lot today. This is just not really a positive one. It's definitely an interesting design, but dare I say it, maybe it was just a little bit too ahead of its time. As I think a small computer like this is a lot more possible nowadays, but unfortunately this one is just being held back too much by its own hardware in my opinion. And it's not a combination of hardware this time like that Toshiba laptop. I think this time I can confidently point my finger in one direction. And about the nicest thing I think I can say to that is that, as we will see in a future video, things can be so much worse than we thought.